But now going on to where John's going to take the wheel is the fantasy week 10 starts and sits. So, John, the floor is yours, my friend.
All right. So the starts and sits of the week. I say this every week. Gonna keep saying it. Not gonna tell you to start Alvin Kamara. Not gonna tell you to sit Alvin Kamara. The guys like that, you know about them. This is more of guys who might be a little more questionable. You're not as confident in, and then also including streaming options if you need somebody to replace a guy on bye week. So some of these guys can maybe even be found on the waivers in your week. So first up for the starts at quarterback. We're going to start with Derek Carr from the Raiders. They're an offense that relies on the explosive plays, and it's been working for them this year. They're playing Kansas City, which doesn't necessarily have the defense or the secondary to stop those explosive plays, and also, I mean, their defensive line just hasn't been able to generate a ton of pressure like they have in the past. So I would say start Derek Carr in this one. I think he's going to be pretty comfortable throughout the game, and I think that he's going to have a pretty solid outing. And if the Chiefs offense ever figures anything out in this one, then maybe it could turn out into a shootout, and that bode even better for Derek Carr because that means they're going to have to put up more points. And the other quarterback of the week is going to be Carson Wentz from the Indianapolis Colts. He's just been looked really good, honestly, over the last 4 or 5 weeks. I'm a bit surprised at how I think he's only owned in about 57% of fantasy leagues. And I think that the way that he's been playing over the last handful of weeks, he looks like he's a solid starter. And I think that if you're in a situation like me in our dynasty leagues where you don't necessarily have an elite level quarterback, or you're like me in my biggest money league, which is Russell Wilson was your starter, I picked up Carson Wentz in both, and he's been my starter for quite a while now. And I think that against the Jacksonville defense, like we talked about, they're not going to be able to have the same success they did against Buffalo because they're going to have to worry about Jonathan Taylor. And I think that's going to open up the play action, the deep ball to Michael Pittman, and just, that's going to open up everything for Carson Wentz in this game. So Carson Wentz and Derek Carr, those are your starting quarterbacks of the week. At running back, first up, J.D. McKissick from the Washington football team. Simply put, nobody runs against Tampa Bay unless your name is Khalil Herbert. Nobody else has success doing it. And what we see often is that the receiving running backs are the ones that are having success against Tampa Bay. I think back to when Miami played them, Myles Gaskin went off for 30 points. J.D. McKissick is a very similar style back. He's the clear go-to guy when it comes to receiving out of that backfield. Start J.D. McKissick this week because I think that he could see quite a bit of work, especially with, Tampa and all the pressure they're going to bring on Taylor Heinicke. Checking the ball down is a really safe option. Next at running back, Javonte Williams from the Denver Broncos. They play Philadelphia, whose run defense has just been really inconsistent. Last week, they had success against Austin Eckler, but we've seen, against some of these other running backs, they just haven't been able to have the same success. I think that the bruising style that Javonte plays with is going to bode success, for him against Philadelphia. It makes me think even when the Cowboys played against Philly, Zeke had a lot of success just because of the power style that he had. I think Javonte is sort of similar in that style. Also, he just breaks a lot of tackles, so he can turn, a 5-yard gain into a 15-yard gain just because of that ability. So start Javonte Williams. And if he's not on the list this week, but if you have Melvin Gordon, start him too. I would start both. I think they're going to be able to run the ball pretty successfully against Philadelphia in this game. At wide receiver, a fellow Bronco, Jerry Judy. I mentioned him earlier when we were talking about this game, but the Eagles actually statistically are one of the better coverage units when it comes to guarding receivers on the outside, but they're one of the worst when it comes to guarding receivers in the slot. So Darius Slay, and I can't remember the other corner they have on the outside this year, but they're having a lot of success on the perimeter to where
It's
the
not still
slot
Avonte
corner.
Maddox, is it? Or is he more their inside? I always forget.
I can't remember where he's playing. I know he's been playing at both throughout the year, but I think he also got hurt at one point. I don't pay a ton of attention to
Philly
Philadelphia, so I
fan
can't.
out there, if you're somewhere out there, tell us in the comments or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I apologize to any Philadelphia fans, but especially since I'm kind of railing your team right now. But yeah, statistically, like I said, their coverage unit on the outside has been one of the best to where their coverage against slot receivers is one of the worst on the year. So Cortland Sutton, Tim Patrick, they could be, getting a lot of the attention. Jerry Judy's been looking really good in the weeks that he's played so far. And I think that Teddy's going to feed him in this one as well. And that also extends to Noah Fant, who's also not on this list, but those guys, that's who you want to start this week, if you're investing in the Broncos offense. The next wide receiver, Hunter Renfro from the Raiders. This is a nice value stack. I know if you play daily fantasy sports, a very popular strategy is to get a QB and wide receiver because, if one does well, if that receiver does well, the QB is probably doing well too. Hunter Renfro, I think, is just going to have a really good outing against the Chiefs. He could draw some coverage from Tyrann Mathieu, but I don't expect that throughout the game because ultimately the Chiefs are just going to be overwhelmed with, potentially the deep balls that Derek Carr is going to be unleashing to Deshaun Jackson, Zay Jones, Bryan Edwards, and Darren Waller. And so I think that Hunter Renfro is going to eat underneath all day long. He's going to get a lot of targets, a lot of reception. This one, start Hunter Renfro. And the final wide receiver start of the week is Julio Jones from the Tennessee Titans. We talked about this earlier when it came to, our picks. They're playing the Saints. Marshawn Lattimore has been playing really well. I expect Marshawn to be going up against A.J. Brown a lot this game. And so that opens up Mr. Julio Jones on the other side to have success. And he's played against the Saints his whole career. So he knows what they do defensively. He knows sort of the typical, things that they do, as well as he's played against a lot of the guys on this team, Cameron Jordan, Marcus Williams, Lattimore. He's played against a lot of them throughout his career, and he's had a ton of success against New Orleans. So start Julio Jones because I think that with no Derrick Henry, with A.J. Brown drawing the coverage on the other side, Julio should be the go-to guy in this one. And finally, at tight end, Pat Freiermuth from the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's been on a heater. He's looking like he's stepping into tight end one territory in fantasy. And he's just been consistent. They play against Detroit, who's just not a very good defense overall. They're the most fantasy-friendly defense for opposing quarterbacks. So if you do need a streaming option, Big Ben's an option this week. But Pat Freiermuth at tight end, he just had success. He's finding, openings in the red zone. He's getting touchdowns. That's what you want out of your tight ends. And I think that's not going to change against Detroit, who just isn't very good defensively. So now moving on to the sits. Once again, not going to tell you some of just the complete, terrible players who you should never be starting in your team. But these are guys who could potentially be making your lineups or could be streaming options, once again, that you might be considering. So at quarterback, Teddy Bridgewater from the Denver Broncos. I think that the Broncos are going to have success in this one. I think that Jerry Judy and Noah Fant specifically could. But ultimately, I think that they're going to rely on the run game pretty heavily. I don't think that Teddy's going to be testing the secondary that they have deep a lot. And so I think it's going to be a lot of dink and dunk and then a lot of handoffs to Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams. So I know in one of my leagues, I'm playing against Teddy Bridgewater as a streaming option this week. Wouldn't do it. I would stay away from him just because I don't think there's going to be a lot of big plays, a lot of touchdowns through the air in this one, a lot more on the run game. Next, Baker Mayfield from the Cleveland Browns. He plays Bill Belichick. Donovan Peoples-Jones has been a solid deep option, but J.C. Jackson's probably going to be covering him a lot of the way. And then I think they're going to want to rely on Dearness Johnson. I keep saying Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb's out. Dearness Johnson in the run game. No matter who's back there in that run game, they're going to want to rely on it. So wouldn't really be trusting Baker Mayfield in this game against the Patriots, who they just tend to have success against quarterbacks who, aren't, the elite of the elite. And at running back, I know that he made this list last week, and we were correct outside of him scoring a touchdown, but it's Adrian Peterson from the Tennessee Titans. Simply put, they play the Saints. The Saints have a pretty solid run defense. And I think that overall, although AP got the touchdown, I was more impressed by Deontay Foreman. I can't remember how to pronounce his name. Deontay Foreman. He, I think, averaged over 5 yards per carry, to where AP, he had like 10 carries, but he only got about 30 yards. So he wasn't really impressive, wasn't able to necessarily, get in there and do a whole lot with what he had. And then also Jeremy McNichols, we already know he's going to steal all the receiving work. So I just wouldn't be banking on AP. He'll get volume. He might get 10 touches, but I just don't think he's going to be able to turn it into much against a Saints defense that's been looking good. And as much as, this is probably going to pain you to bring this up, Antonio Gibson from the Washington football team, simply put, it's Tampa Bay. Don't test Tampa Bay. J.D. McKissick gets all the receiving value. Don't start Boobie Gibson. This isn't Boobie Gibson, but don't start Antonio Gibson this week. At wide receiver, a few guys that I've already mentioned. Don't start Cortland Sutton this week. He's going against Darius Slay, who's been very good on the outside, one of the best coverage corners guarding number one receivers this year. Wouldn't start Cortland Sutton. He's just not getting the volume right now in the offense since Jerry Judy's returned. And I wouldn't expect this to be the week that turns around with a really tough matchup ahead. Next, Donovan Peoples-Jones from the Cleveland Browns. He's going to be guarded by J.C. Jackson a majority of this one. There's no Odell Beckham in Cleveland anymore. Jarvis Landry works primarily from the slot, and so Donovan Peoples-Jones, he's the next man up to be guarded by J.C. Jackson. I think a majority of the game he's going to be shadowing him for the most part on the left side. So wouldn't be testing. Just recently changed his IG handle to Mr. INT this week in J.C. Jackson. And finally, Jameson Crowder from the New York Jets. They play Buffalo, who's been, I think, statistically the best pass defense in the NFL this year. And also, Elijah Moore has just been pushing him and for more and more snaps every single week. Corey Davis looks like he's going to come back this week as well. And I think that Jameson Crowder could be the person who's directly affected by both of those guys and their availability. So I wouldn't start Jameson Crowder this week if you got him. Finally, at tight end, Hunter Henry from the New England Patriots. There's about 4 or 5 weeks there where he was finding the end zone pretty consistently, but over the last couple of games, he only has about a 10% target share, so he's just not really getting involved much. And then Jonnu Smith, the other tight end, he actually has about an 11% target share. So at worst, they're equal, but it looks like Jonnu is just barely edging him out over the last few games. And so he's just incredibly touchdown dependent. And I wouldn't bet on that this week in a game against Cleveland, who's going to want to run the ball, keep the ball out of the Patriots' hands. And it just could be not a lot of offensive possessions in this one to where we're getting those opportunities for Hunter Henry to get a touchdown. So those are the starts and sits of week 10. If you have questions, feel free to drop them down below in the comments. If we're not responding right away, because it's a little harder to stay active in response on YouTube, we do stay really active on our Instagram. Follow us there. Post your questions on the post there. We respond to every single one.
And just to reinforce one last point, I'm even benching Antonio Gibson in one of my money leagues. I think I started Javonte and I have Jonathan Taylor. So yeah, this was before John even did the start to sit. So this is just me just also basically agreeing with that. Like it's been tough as a Antonio Gibson owner. So
yeah,
if you're an Antonio Gibson owner, mention in the comments wherever you're seeing this. We can all sympathize together as to about how our pick has gone. So otherwise, like John mentioned, that's the pod right there. As per usual, like John mentioned, Instagram is at Shut Up and Ball Pod. Twitter and our TikTok is at Shut Up and Ball, and we have a Facebook page as well. But that will be all, y'all. Have a nice weekend.